Judge Frank Caprio thought he was starting just another case, but the man standing in chains was the boy who came from his past. This isn't just a story about crime and justice. It's about memory, silence, and the heavy cost of doing what's right. Don't go anywhere. What happens next will stay with you. Like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. The courtroom was busier than usual. The hum of voices under breath, the rustle of legal pads, the soft clatter of shoes on tile. It all blurred into the background as Judge Frank Caprio took his seat at the bench. After nearly 2 decades on the job, most days felt the same. A name, a charge, a sentence. Another file closed. Another life judged. But not this one. The bailiff called the next case. State of Louisiana versus Manuel Anderson. Frank barely glanced at the docket. His fingers reached for the gavel almost out of habit. Then the doors opened, and the man was brought in. The chains around his wrists didn't rattle much, but somehow they sounded louder than they should have. He walked with the slow, heavy pace of someone used to being watched, used to being measured. His suit was loose at the shoulders, the cuffs too long, and his hair, what was left of it, was touched with gray. But the face, Frank froze. It wasn't possible. Not after all these years. Yet there he stood, Manuel Anderson. His Manuel. The boy from the cane fields. The one who had run through the dirt roads beside him. 2 kids chasing nothing but the wind and each other. The boy who once carved his initials into the old pecan tree behind Frank's grandmother's house. The boy with dreams too big for Hammond, Louisiana. Now he was here, in cuffs. Frank's hand trembled. The gavel nearly slipped from his fingers. His eyes locked on Manuel, but Manuel didn't meet them at first. Then, just for a moment, he looked up. Their eyes met. And in that instant, a lifetime crashed between them. Manuel's expression didn't change. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. But something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, sadness, and something else Frank couldn't quite name. Disappointment, maybe. Then Manuel looked down again. Frank forced himself upright, his jaw tightening. He glanced down at the file again, this time really seeing it. Assault, robbery, Baton Rouge convenience store, a minor injury to the clerk, cash stolen, suspect apprehended nearby. It read like a dozen other cases he'd handled, but it wasn't. This was Manuel. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Anderson," he began, his voice stiffer than usual. "You are charged with armed robbery and aggravated assault. How do you plead?" Manuel didn't lift his eyes. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said. His voice was lower than Frank remembered, rougher, worn. But still, it was his. Frank nodded, slowly, mechanically. "Noted," he replied, barely hearing his own voice. He felt as though the air had thickened around him. The prosecutor stood to begin his remarks, but Frank barely listened. His eyes kept drifting back to Manuel, watching the way he sat, rigid, guarded, silent. It wasn't fear he saw. It was something quieter. Resignation. Frank's mind raced, though his face remained unreadable. "What happened to you, Manuel? Where did your path go so far from mine? And why does it feel like I should have seen this coming?" Manuel never looked up again. He just sat there, waiting. Frank read the next lines of the case file with a voice that sounded far too even for what he felt. But inside, every word was a bruise. He had judged thousands of cases, sentenced men he'd never known, detached, objective, fair. But now he stood in front of a man who had once been his closest friend. And as he looked at Manuel Anderson, shackled and silent in the courtroom they never imagined they'd share, Frank Caprio understood, with a weight he hadn't known until now. This case would change him, whether he wanted it to or not. As the court recessed for the midday break, Frank returned to his chambers, though he felt as though he were walking through fog. He loosened his collar, sat heavily in his chair, and stared out the narrow window at the gray sky above Baton Rouge. So many cases had passed through his courtroom, some cut deeper than others, but none quite like this. On his desk lay the file he hadn't opened again. He didn't need to. The charges, the statute, the legal details, he'd already memorized them, as any judge would. But it wasn't the law that haunted him. It was the face behind the defendant's name. Manuel Anderson. Not just a case number, not just a file. A memory drifted in. Two boys sitting side by side on a crumbling stone wall near the river, their feet dangling above the water, sharing the last half of a sandwich they'd stolen from Frank's mother's kitchen. "One day," Manuel had said, his eyes fixed on the distant treetops, "we'll get out of here. Somewhere different. Somewhere we belong." Back then, they hadn't spoken of color. Not directly. They hadn't known how deep it ran, how far the roots of difference stretched beneath the soil of Hammond. They only knew they liked the same books, the same jokes, the same feeling of the wind rushing past their ears when they raced their bikes down the gravel road. They were inseparable. Until the world reminded them that some lines weren't meant to be crossed. Frank could still see the look on his father's face, that hard line across his jaw, the silence that stung more than shouting. It had been late afternoon. He and Manuel were sitting by the riverbank, a book open between them, reading aloud and laughing softly. His father had walked up without a word, stood for a moment, then said, "Inside. Now." Nothing more. No raised voice, just finality. A line drawn without explanation. He'd obeyed. He hadn't even looked back at Manuel. Later, he was told that Manuel's family had moved. Pressure, they said. Whispers. Rumors. Some stories don't need retelling to do their damage. Frank had gone on to a better school in Baton Rouge. Law school. A career on the bench. And Manuel, he had vanished into the folds of the past until this morning, when fate, or something crueler, brought him back through the courthouse doors in chains. Frank stood slowly, walking to the small window at the back of the room. Outside, the courthouse square shimmered in the heat. Frank had always believed in fairness, in rules, in order. But now he saw how those same rules had failed Manuel long before this courtroom. They'd failed him when their town pretended not to notice that one child wore shoes patched with tape, while the other had new ones each September. They'd failed him when teachers dismissed his questions, when neighbors locked their doors a little faster if he passed too close. And they had failed when Frank, all those years ago, said nothing. It wasn't guilt that filled his chest. It was something quieter, heavier, recognition. Margaret, his longtime clerk, knocked gently and entered. "Everything all right, Judge?" she asked, setting a stack of documents on his desk. Frank hesitated. "Just a tough case, that's all." She paused, studying him. "I know that name meant something to you. I saw your face when he walked in." He looked up at her. For a moment, the judge's mask slipped, and behind it was the boy who had once laughed beside Manuel at the county fair, who had once been pulled apart from him not by time, but by silence. "We were friends, once," he said quietly. "A long time ago." Margaret nodded. "Sometimes the past comes back in ways we don't expect." Frank gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The thing is, Margaret, we made a promise once." He said, "We'll always look out for each other." And now here we are. He's the one on trial, and I'm the one meant to judge him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to make it right all at once. Just don't forget what fairness really means." The court would resume in 15 minutes. The routine would continue. Witnesses, testimonies, objections. But for Frank, something had already shifted. This case was no longer about robbery. It was about the space between two boys who had once dreamed under the same sky, and the distance time, silence, and society had carved between them. He straightened his robe and stood tall. He would return to the bench, but part of him remained by that riverbank, beside a friend he had once promised to stand by before the world taught them both how fragile such promises could be. The courtroom had returned to its quiet rhythm after the morning recess, but Frank Caprio's thoughts were anything but still. He adjusted his robe, letting out a long, measured breath before stepping back to the bench. As he settled into his seat, His eyes couldn't help but find Manuel again. The prosecutor stood again, methodical and unwavering. He replayed the security footage, this time slowed, enhanced, frame by frame. The figure in the red hoodie lunged across the counter and disappeared off-screen. The resolution remained poor. The image offered suggestion, not certainty. Still, he turned to the jury and spoke as if the truth had been made plain. "This man," he said, pointing, "was apprehended just 2 blocks away. He wore clothing matching the description. He had no explanation for his presence near the scene." Frank watched Manuel from above. He had not shifted. He sat like stone, shoulders still, eyes forward, jaw clenched, not defiant, not broken. Just steady. The first witness was called, the store clerk. His voice was hesitant, his memory blurred by adrenaline and time. "He wore a hoodie, red, I think. It happened fast. He was yelling. I couldn't see his face clearly." Maya Jackson, the defense attorney, leaned forward. "Are you certain it was Mr. Anderson?" The man hesitated. I'm not sure. It was dark. He had the hood up." A murmur passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor objected. Frank sustained, but inside, something twisted. He'd heard testimony like this before, vague, incomplete, and yet enough to ruin a man's life. Then came the arresting officer. Tall, uniform pressed, voice firm. Suspect matched the description. Black male, mid-40s, dark clothes, found within proximity of the scene. Maya stood. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Officer," she said gently, "what exactly did that description say?" "Red hoodie, jeans, mid-height." "Did Mr. Anderson have on a red hoodie when you arrested him?" "No." "Did you search the area?" "Briefly." "Did you find a weapon?" "No." "Any stolen cash?" The officer paused. "Not at the time." "So, you detained a man based on skin tone, clothing, and geography?" Objection. Sustained. Frank's chest tightened. He couldn't move, couldn't flinch, couldn't react. Not even when he wanted to walk down from the bench and stand beside the boy he once knew to tell the jury that proximity isn't guilt, that matching a vague description has been the downfall of too many men who look like Manuel. He scanned the jury. Faces of curiosity, distrust. One or two looked away when Manuel turned toward them. And in that instant, Frank saw it, the centuries-old tension that sat unspoken in that room. It wasn't in the evidence. It was in the air. That night, Frank did not sleep. He sat in his study, the case file open on his lap, the lamp casting long shadows across the carpet. He read Manuel's record again. Petty theft, loitering, trespassing, all scattered across years of low-wage jobs and closed doors. He imagined Manuel as a young man, one rejection after another, a system that offered nothing and punished everything. Frank leaned back, hands over his face. He didn't know if Manuel was innocent, but he knew what this trial had become. Not a search for truth, a rehearsal of assumptions. He turned back to the statute. Louisiana. Revised Statute 1464.4. Armed robbery. Minimum 20 years. No parole. No mercy. Meant for violent criminals. But here it was, hanging over the head of a man with no weapon, no clear motive, and no clear identification. Just the wrong place, the wrong time, and the wrong skin. The next morning, he returned to the bench with heavier steps. The gallery had filled early. The reporters were back. Maya stood, ready. She called no new witness. She simply turned to the jury. "The law is clear," she said. "But justice, true justice, requires more than just matching a shadow in a video. It requires that we ask if we are being fair, not just by the book, but by conscience." Frank didn't look at Manuel. He couldn't, not yet. The silence stretched a moment longer before Maya rose from her seat, her expression unreadable, but her purpose unmistakable. The defense table was quiet behind her. Manuel still seated, hands folded, eyes lowered. She took a slow breath, then stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear, steady. "The defense calls Officer Tom Harris to the stand." The room shifted slightly. Chairs creaked, heads turned, as a tall man in uniform stepped forward. His boots echoed softly as he approached. Frank's gaze followed him, not just as a judge watching a witness, but as a man watching the machinery of justice grind forward, knowing full well that sometimes it crushed more than it corrected. Officer Tom Harris, the arresting officer, adjusted his uniform as he took his seat, his jaw tight, eyes wary. He had been on the force for over 2 decades, and it showed in the way he spoke, in the way he avoided saying too much. Maya stood, a folder in her hand, her voice steady but calm. "Officer Harris, you were the one who arrested Mr. Manuel Anderson, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, nodding. "You stated in your report that he matched the suspect's description?" "I did. Can you clarify what that description was?" Harris shifted slightly. "Black male, mid-40s, medium build, wearing dark clothes." "Dark clothes," Maya repeated. "Not a red hoodie?" "No, but he could have taken it off before I got there." "Did you find one nearby? Did you search the area?" Harris hesitated. "No, we were told the suspect was moving on foot. I acted quickly." Maya stepped forward, voice low, almost gentle. "So, no hoodie, no weapon, and no search?" He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. "One more question, officer. Did you stop Mr. Anderson because he matched a clear description, or because he looked like someone who might have done it?" The silence rang louder than any answer. Harris's eyes flicked toward the jury, then back down. "I followed the procedure," he muttered. Frank watched the jury shift, exchanging uncertain glances. The lines on his own face deepened. He had seen this before, not the moment itself, but what came after. The quiet dismissal of details, the soft closing of doors. It was always the same. The story was written before the truth could speak. The next witness took the stand, a video forensics expert named Grace Wilkins. Her demeanor was calm, almost detached, but her words landed with precision. "I've reviewed the footage submitted by the prosecution. The individual in the video appears to be roughly 5'10". Mr. Anderson, according to records, is 6'1". Could the discrepancy be camera distortion?" Maya asked. Wilkins shook her head. "We accounted for angle and scale. There's a significant mismatch. Also," she paused, glancing at her notes, "there are signs the footage was spliced. The timestamp is inconsistent. Certain seconds are missing." The prosecutor rose, quick to object. "Speculation. There's no proof this was done intentionally." "Perhaps," Wilkins replied, "but intentional or not, the integrity of the footage is compromised." Frank looked down at his hands. They rested still on the bench, but he felt them trembling beneath the surface. He had always believed in the law, its structure, its order. But the longer he sat there, the more cracks he saw in its foundation. The arrest, the footage, the rush to conviction. Everything pointed not to a search for truth, but a system too tired to care. He remembered something Manuel once said when they were boys. "People don't see what's in front of them. They see what they expect." Back then, it had sounded like frustration. Now it sounded like prophecy. The court recessed briefly. When they returned, Maya rose again. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firmer now, "my client wishes to address the court directly." A murmur spread through the room. Frank straightened. "That's irregular. He's already testified." "I understand," Maya said, glancing toward Manuel. "But he's asked to speak, not as a witness, as a man." Frank looked at Manuel then, the same boy from long ago, only now with eyes that had seen too much. There was no defiance in them, no anger, just quiet resolve. The rules were clear, but rules, Frank thought, were written for clean cases. This one wasn't. Nothing about this was clean. He gave a slight nod. "Permission granted." Manuel stood slowly. No chains this time. No script. Just a man with too much to say, and only moments to say it. Frank didn't know what he would hear, but for the first time in his life on the bench, he had chosen not to follow the rulebook. He had chosen to listen. The courtroom was still. No one moved. The only sound was the faint click of chains as Manuel stood and made his way to the witness stand. Each step echoed. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at Frank. He looked straight ahead, as if steadying himself against something no one else could see. When he reached the stand, he placed both hands on the edge. His wrists bore the marks of the cuffs, and for a moment, he simply breathed. Then, he began. "I know I'm not the best man in this room," he said, his voice low, steady, but filled with something tight beneath the surface. "I've made mistakes. I've done time. But not this time." He glanced briefly toward the jury. "I didn't rob that store. I didn't hurt anyone. They picked me up because I was nearby, because I looked like someone who might do something like that. Looked like. That's what the officer said." He paused and his voice dropped lower. What he meant was, "I'm a black man," and that was enough. A quiet ripple passed through the room, but no one spoke. Manuel looked down, then back up. "I've lived my whole life with people crossing the street when I walk by, being followed in stores, told I don't belong, without anyone needing to say it out loud. I've been asked to leave restaurants I just sat down in. I've been asked what I'm doing around here, like I need permission to exist." His gaze found a spot on the far wall, somewhere just above Frank's shoulder. "I've tried. God knows I've tried. I took night shifts. I kept my head down. I stayed out of trouble. But trying doesn't matter when the world's already decided who you are." Frank shifted slightly in his seat. His hands clenched the edge of the bench, knuckles pale. The words coming from Manuel weren't new, but hearing them here, under oath, in this sacred place of justice, made them heavier, more real. Manuel continued, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for pity. I just want to be seen. Not as a suspect. Not as a case file. Not as a silhouette in a blurry video. But as a man. A man who bleeds when he's cut. A man who's tired of trying to prove he belongs." A long silence followed, the kind that fills every corner of a room and stretches time. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the bailiff stood still, eyes fixed forward. Frank looked at the jury. He saw something shifting, a softening in the lines of their faces, a weight beginning to settle on their shoulders, the same weight that had been building on his own since the trial began. Manuel sat down, his hands folded quietly in his lap. He didn't look proud. He didn't look defeated. He looked like someone who had finally said something he'd needed to say his whole life. Closing arguments began, but to Frank Caprio, they came like echoes behind glass. He watched, listened, noted, but his thoughts were far ahead, already wandering the corridors of what might follow. The prosecutor stood first. His tone was formal, his words carefully measured. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is not about speculation. It's about facts. The suspect was found near the scene. His appearance matched the description. The arrest followed protocol. The footage aligns with the events. Justice," he said with mechanical precision, "demands consistency, and the law provides it." Frank watched him. He wasn't angry. The man was doing his job. But there was no life in his words, no hesitation, no room for doubt. Then Maya rose. Her presence filled the space, not with volume, but with something softer, something steady. She stepped toward the jury, voice calm but heavy with truth. "You've heard the evidence," she said. "You've seen the gaps. You've felt them, even if you couldn't name them. What happened to Manuel Anderson wasn't just about one night. It was about years of being seen as less, years of being dismissed, overlooked, labeled." She paused, then added, "Don't let color cloud your judgment. Don't let a flawed system push you to make another mistake. Justice is not about how quickly we close a case. It's about who we become when we choose to see clearly." There was no drama in her delivery, no trembling hands, just truth. And that truth settled over the courtroom like a weight no one could shake. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. The minutes stretched into hours. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters stepped outside. Family members whispered among themselves. Even the bailiff took a seat near the back. But Frank remained at the bench, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the empty jury box. His heart was heavier than he cared to admit. He wasn't the one delivering the verdict. He knew that. But he also knew this. Jurors watched more than evidence. They watched faces. They watched pauses. They watched the way a judge's voice shifts ever so slightly when he says, "Permission granted." Frank's voice had shifted, and he knew they had heard it. The room felt colder now. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the stained oak walls, the worn seal above his head. 20 years in this chair. 20 years believing in the structure of it all. And now, today, watching Manuel speak, watching that quiet dignity stand against the weight of assumption, he wondered if the structure needed more than maintenance. Maybe it needed new ground. A soft knock. The bailiff opened the door and entered. "Your Honor, the jury's ready." The words landed like a stone in Frank's chest. The courtroom filled once more. No one spoke. No one fidgeted. The jury filed in, solemn and deliberate, their foreperson holding a folded sheet of paper in trembling hands. Manuel sat still, eyes forward. Maya beside him, whispering nothing at all. Frank took a breath. "In the matter of the state of Louisiana versus Manuel Anderson," the foreperson began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We find the defendant." She paused, the silence snapping tight. "Not guilty." A beat of stillness followed. Then, breath. It wasn't loud, no cheering, no applause, but something in the room exhaled. Shoulders dropped, eyes closed. A release, quiet and long overdue. Manuel lowered his head. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply folded into himself for a moment, hands clasped, as if unsure whether to believe what he'd heard. For a man who had spent his life being doubted, even freedom could feel like another kind of disbelief. Frank tapped his gavel once. "Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." Around him, the courtroom began to empty, but he remained behind, watching Manuel as he signed the last of the paperwork. There was no conversation between them, just a quiet glance as people passed. The courtroom had emptied. The last of the staff had gone, the lights overhead dimmed to their evening glow. Papers had been cleared, chairs pushed in, but the air still held something unspoken, something unfinished. Frank Caprio remained seated at the bench, his robe slightly wrinkled, his hands resting motionless in his lap. The sound of the heavy doors echoed as they opened once more. He looked up. Manuel stood there just inside the threshold. He wasn't in cuffs anymore. No chains, no guards, just a man, standing free, yet still carrying something too heavy to name. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Manuel stepped forward, each footstep soft against the floor, until he stood at the same spot he had so many times before. But this time, he wasn't the defendant, he was just Manuel. He looked up at Frank. "You knew me," he said quietly. "You knew who I was. Why didn't you say anything?" Frank's breath caught. The words hit harder than he expected, not because they were sharp, but because they were true. "I wanted to," Frank replied, his voice hoarse. "Every day of that trial I wanted to say I knew you, that we'd shared something real once. But if I'd spoken, everything could have unraveled. Your case would have collapsed under conflict of interest. And you," he paused, swallowing hard, "you wouldn't have had a fair chance, and I couldn't take that away from you." Manuel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Frank's. "So you stayed silent to protect me?" Frank looked down at his hands. "I stayed silent to protect the process. That's what I told myself. But part of me wonders if I was really just protecting the robe, the seat, the rules. I've spent years following them so closely, I forgot that sometimes justice doesn't sit where we think it does." Manuel didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the bench, the ceiling, the stained wood that surrounded them both. "You know," he said finally, "I never expected fairness. Not from this place, not from anyone. But you gave me something close. You gave me the chance to speak, to be seen. That's more than I ever thought I'd get." There was no accusation in his voice, just a quiet tiredness, the kind that settles after years of being looked through. Frank felt his throat tighten. "I should have done more. Back then, even now, I should have said something." "But you didn't," Manuel said gently. "And maybe that's okay." Frank looked up, startled. "You didn't save me," Manuel continued. "But you didn't let me drown either. That matters." Frank blinked hard, the lines around his eyes softening. "I didn't think you'd want to see me again." Manuel gave a faint smile. "I wasn't sure either, but I needed to say thank you. Not because everything's fixed, it's not, but because you reminded me I'm not invisible." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time, it was almost peaceful. They stood there, two men shaped by the same childhood, pulled by different currents, meeting once more in the quiet wreckage of justice. Manuel turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Take care of that bench," he said, nodding toward it. "It still matters, more than people think." Frank nodded. His voice didn't come, but his eyes spoke enough. Then Manuel walked out, his steps slow but sure, disappearing through the doors and into the night beyond. Frank remained. The courtroom felt different now, not empty, but changed. He looked around. The flag, the seal, the worn wood beneath his hands, and he felt something shift, not like a burden lifting, but like a door opening. Just a crack. From that day on, Frank didn't speak of the trial. Not to reporters, not to colleagues, but those who watched him closely began to notice. A longer pause before sentencing, a second glance at a file, a quiet nod to defense attorneys when their voices trembled. The law didn't change, the building didn't change, but Frank did. Not all at once, not loudly, but quietly, in the quiet way that mattered most. And that's where we leave them. Frank Caprio, sitting alone in a quiet courtroom, and Manuel Anderson, walking out into a world that still doesn't promise fairness, but for once, gave him a chance. This wasn't just a story about law and order. It was about friendship lost and found in the most unlikely of places, about the weight of silence, about what it means to truly see someone across years, across systems, across history. If this story made you pause, even just for a second, I invite you to reflect on the power of choice. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from a verdict. Sometimes it begins with a simple decision to listen. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If you found value in this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And as always, take care of one another. I'll see you in the next story.